Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. All right, well, thank you guys again for joining us this week. In a recent episode, we discussed America's fastest growing Christian faith, known generally as the New Apostolic Reformation, and its influence on the political landscape. And we've also talked about Christian nationalism and the calling that its adherents are pursuing to, I'm using air quotes here, take back America for Jesus. Without a doubt, the intermingling of religion and politics, it's just messy. And it can be incredibly polarizing, particularly when whoever you're following, if they declare something to be a Christian choice, whether that's a particular candidate or policy or procedure, but maybe that deemed choice doesn't align with the biblical example of Christ. And so it's understandable that some might wonder, what might it look like to leave religion out of politics altogether? Well, if you're wondering that, you don't have to look any further than France. Instead of espousing a similar freedom of religion posture as the United States, France has decidedly adopted a freedom from religion posture, at least in the public sphere. So, Jim, can you talk more about that and talk about what it looks like in practice?
Yeah. If you've ever been to France as a tourist, which I have been on a few times, you wouldn't think that was the case at all. I mean, you see Muslim women wearing headscarves. You see Catholic churches feeling on almost every corner, and grand historical ones as well, everywhere. One of the most famous cathedrals, Christian cathedrals in the world, Notre Dame, is right there in the heart of Paris, right off the Seine. So you've got it right there. And when it burned down, France immediately committed itself to repairing it. But don't be misled. France has a principle known as licite, which is a French word which loosely translates as secularism. What that means in practice is absolutely no excessive crosses or head coverings, excessive or any other religious symbol in public French society. That means by staff, students in public schools, hospitals, courts, sports fields. Now, most modern Western democracies have a separation of church and state, but the French version really is different. Whether if you're in the UK or the United States, really it means that you have a multicultural approach to things. In the US, it's really primarily keeping the state out of the church. It's not keeping the church out of the state. In France, it means the restriction of religious expressions in public places. The goal is to keep those spaces neutral, and emphasizing as they would, their line is that which unites more than that which separates. That's the only thing that we want in public spaces. That way of phrasing it, by the way, comes directly from a guide written by the Education Ministry's Council on Secularism. Yes, they have an official council on secularism. As early as the 1880s, actually, they had laws that were not only made education free and mandatory, but also required public schools to present no faith viewpoint whatsoever in the curriculum. Avoid any and all faith viewpoints. Pastors were uniformly banned from teaching, whether they said anything or not. If you're a pastor, you just can't teach. No religious symbols were allowed in the classroom of any kind. To have it be any other way was seen as disturbing the peace. This was tested in 1989, rather famously. It was kind of covered internationally when 3 students refused to take off their headscarves, and they were expelled. The country's highest administrative court said that, okay, well, we might allow that kind of clothing, but only if it doesn't constitute an act of pressure, provocation, proselytism, or propaganda. In this case, they said it did, and they supported the expulsion. After a number of similar incidents began to happen, they came out in 2004 with a law that said, you know what, we're not even going to allow it at all for any reason, period. It's just banned. Anything that clearly manifests belonging to any kind of religion or any kind of religious belonging in public schools. Last year, that ban was extended to include clothing that was just traditionally worn in Muslim majority countries. Uh, this was widely criticized, including the U.S. government's Commission on International Religious Freedom. It was internationally condemned. Uh, but their thinking is that secularism is absolutely crucial for younger people to be free from proselytism and free from radicalization. And radicalization is actually Christianity is what drove it early on, which we'll get into, I'm sure. But right now, it's radicalization. That's a big issue in France. They are still deeply traumatized by the attacks by Islamist terrorists in Paris in 2015 that killed over 150 people. But it doesn't cut both ways. They don't want it in the public sphere because they don't want any proselytism, but they very much want to baptize people in the religion of secularism. The education ministry recently published a book reminding schools that students cannot refuse subject matters that seem to be contrary to their convictions. So, in other words, you have to let us put what we feel philosophically into you, but you can't bring any of that to bear on yourself. In other words, you can't put up filters, but we're not going to let you do anything. Opposite of that. I think you're going to see this talked about quite a bit. When we're recording this, it's in the summer. We're a handful of weeks away from the Summer Olympics that are held in France. And I think we're going to hear this quite a bit with the Olympics, and for reason that, in fact, I've already seen a number of articles starting to come out about the idea of secularism there in France, because their ban on religious symbols for its athletes will be talked about. It'll be pronounced because they will not let, for example, their Muslim athletes wear any kind of scarf or any type of other dress that would symbolize coming from a Muslim country, and they're not going to let an athlete have a cross around their neck. It will be talked about because I have no doubt, prediction time, some of their athletes are going to test that and to make a political and religious statement. They'll allow athletes from other countries to observe their own regulations, but French athletes will not be allowed to wear anything or be anything but strictly secular in every possible way. So that's a taste of what we're talking about.
Yeah, we've got to dive now then into kind of the background behind this, because it is worth noting that, France's approach is not only different from America's approach, but it's also unique among European countries. So what is in the background of this for France, and how long has this been the policy?
This is worth understanding in the flow of cultural history. It really is, and so we have to go back a little bit, specifically to the age of the Enlightenment, to really understand this. Those who lived in the 18th century had no doubt that they were living in what they would have called an enlightened age, one that had emerged from a time of twilight. And for them, that would mean the Middle Ages. Between 1650 and 1750, you come to the time of enormous luminaries, Sir Isaac Newton and Leibniz and Fontenelle and Spinoza and John Locke and David Hume and Diderot and Voltaire. Owen Chadwick, the historian, rightly noted that these were just the seminal years of modern intellectual history, and he's right. And then within that span of time, the last remaining vestiges of the Middle Ages were lost and were gone, eradicated. But more than an era ended. Another historian, Mark Knoll, has noted that you had an increasing number of European intellectuals who were just using new ideas about the natural world and society and the nature of things. They were using these new ideas to attack the established churches, to question traditional views of divine revelation, and even in an unprecedented step for the flow of cultural history, if you understand the Middle Ages, to even question or doubt the existence of God, or at least the Christian idea of God as Father. At best, the divine had become a philosophical category, a first mover in the grand scheme of things. So Peter Gay, who's done as much work on the Enlightenment as anybody, refers to Enlightenment as the rise of modern paganism, which sounds strong, but I think he's right. To properly understand the Enlightenment, it really must be seen as more than an age. It has to be understood as a spirit. While, yes, it produced the hymns of Isaac Watts and the deeply Christian music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and you had Handel's Messiah produced during this time, and the German movement known as Pietism, and the ministries of John Wesley and George Whitefield, and even the First Great Awakening came out during this time. The dominant spirit of the age was anything but Christian. Anything. The spirit of the age instead belonged to the philosophers, those who embraced the Enlightenment culture and popularized it for all who would listen, and many did listen. Henry May captured the spirit of the Enlightenment, I think, best. He said there's two propositions when you really want to understand the spirit of the Enlightenment. First is that the present age is more enlightened than the past. Second, that we understand nature and man, humanity, best through the use of our natural faculties. The Enlightenment Project, have you ever heard that phrase, the Enlightenment Project? That was really the rejection of revelation, the rejection of tradition, the rejection of divine illumination as the best guide for human beings. Instead, autonomous human reason reigned supreme. The motto of Immanuel Kant, who one of the most significant thinkers of this period, was dare to use your own reason, or even just simply dare to know. But this, and that was also his personal definition of the Enlightenment. You want to know the definition of Enlightenment? It says, dare to use your own reason. And there are several words in that phrase that are important to really understand why that was so significant. I mean, just even the first word, dare. Dare, meaning that if you did use reason, you would inevitably come up against the traditional authorities and the status quo, namely the church. So it's going to be a daring thing because you're going to be taking on the church. But that was the point, that there could be no authority, no, over the exercise of or conclusions of reason and rationality. The idea of authority is very critical here because for the Enlightenment, much of it was a rebellion against one source of authority, that of the church and its appeal to God and his revelation, and the enthronement of another authority, which was human reason. It really was that kind of battle going on. So for someone like the French philosopher Voltaire, the Enlightenment offered emancipation from prone submission to the heavenly will. Anyway, back to Kant and his words. So dare was a big one. When he said your own reason, your own, highlights the independence of human intellect and answerable to none, and best able to function independent, separate of anything thought to come from God. And then there's Kant's final word, which obviously is reason. Dare to use your own reason, which for most Enlightenment thinkers, such as like the Scottish philosopher David Hume, meant some type of empiricism. Empiricism elevated experience above all other sources for the gaining of knowledge. And that meant sense experience, that which could be tasted, touched, heard, smelled, felt. And that introduced the scientific method, obviously, of experimentation, famously by Francis Bacon, also during this period. He died in 1626. What could not be observed or at least replicated was met with skepticism. What we would say today is, if it can't be seen, tasted, touched, smelled, if it can't be replicated, tested in a test tube, and it's not that you can't know it, it's irrelevant, would be the idea. The fundamental idea was that we could begin with ourselves and gain the means by which to judge all things. And not only that we could, but that we should. The challenge this brought to the Christian faith was just simply profound. Alistair McGrath did a good job of charting out the progression. And again, I think he was quite right when he did it this way, was that when all this began, the development of the Enlightenment Project, if you will, it was the first wave of it was very sympathetic and toward Christian faith. And it argued that the beliefs of Christianity were rational, so this new rationality is not going to be any problem with Christianity, and thus able to stand up under any amount of intellectual scrutiny. It's because Christianity is rational, so this is, we're good. But it was then argued that the basic ideas of Christianity, being rational, could be derived from reason itself, independent from revelation. Then it went further and said, okay, now if that's the case, then reason should be able to stand over revelation as judge. If reason was omnicompetent, as Enlightenment thinkers believed, it was supremely qualified to judge Christian beliefs and practices. If reason could not produce a particular tenet of Christian faith, and that particular tenet was suspect, only what human reason could demonstrate became enshrined. Um, and that's why you have, I don't know if you've ever heard of, Thomas Jefferson was deeply influenced by the French Revolution and Enlightenment thinking, and he actually produced his own version of the Bible. I've got a copy. It's like the New Testament. It's like that big. He cut out everything that was supernatural. He cut out
I was gonna
everything
say,
that was miraculous.
for those who are not watching, for us,
Oh, I was making a little, a very small little book, because he cut out everything that reason could not have produced, and so that eliminated the miraculous. Such movements illustrate May's conclusion that the issue is not about the Enlightenment's relationship to religion. It's really about the Enlightenment as a religion. Now, the speed by which Enlightenment thinking, I'm getting to your question, the speed by which Enlightenment thinking took hold was absolutely breathtaking. When you consider that the unquestioned voice of knowledge and duty for the Western European mind in the early 17th century was felt to be God himself, particularly as conveyed through the biblical writings, theology reigned supreme. It was still the queen of the sciences, and that was how you looked at everything, through science or philosophy. Even Descartes originally wrote or began, that it's an infallible absolute rule that what God has revealed is incomparably more certain than anything else. But by the end of the era, the church had been marginalized, theology dethroned as the queen of the sciences, the Christian worldview reduced to a fading memory, and for the first time since the 4th century, the church was once again the object of persecution. That's breathtaking. So this was what took place. Now, the most visible manifestation of this seismic shift was the French Revolution, where a religion of man was established. A process of de-Christianization began, so much so that Alexis de Tocqueville would later write that in France, Christianity was attacked with almost frenzied violence. One of the more symbolic events took place on November 10th of 1793, a very famous date, when Notre Dame, the great cathedral, the great church of France, most famous of all of the Gothic cathedrals, with a foundation stone laid by Pope Alexander III in 1163, no less, to give you a sense of its rootedness in church history, it was formally declared on that day and transformed into what was called the Temple of Reason, with busts of Rousseau and Voltaire taking the place of the saints. And during the ceremony, a hymn was written that was sung, a hymn to liberty, and part of its words were, "Holy Liberty, come dwell in this temple, be the goddess of the French." You want roots? Those are the roots.
No kidding. That was worth that history lesson was worthwhile. So thank you for that. Now, in writing about writing for the Atlantic about this laicite policy, the secularization in France, a few years ago, Rachel Donadio, she wrote something that I thought was pretty insightful. So I'm going to quote her. She said, "The intentions in France and the U.S. seem similar, but they are not the same. The U.S., in guaranteeing freedom of religion, sought to shield religion from state involvement. France, in guaranteeing freedom of religion, sought to shield the state from religious involvement. This distinction has consequences." So in other words, choosing the priority, whether it's your faith or whether it's your nation, that's something that Christians are increasingly having to wrestle with, in both small and pretty significant ways, particularly when Christians are called to live among a people who do not share your faith, and not only to live among them, but to love them well. So can you talk a little bit more about that tension?
Yeah, and I like how you phrase that question. Let's talk about the tension in terms of how it has played out in terms of mission.
Hmm.
And let's use the UK as a foil, who embraced religious involvement with the state, as opposed to the United States, which did not embrace that relationship. So let's kind of use those as our examples to kind of explore this a little bit. In the essence, in the United States, we did not want government running the church. In the UK, they had the government running the church, the state church. Nathan Hatch wrote a really good book on this, The Democratization of American Christianity, which I've always liked. And he talked about how the democratic spirit deeply affected popular religious movements, and especially Christianity in the United States. He said it did it in three ways. First, he said there was the denial of the age-old distinction that set the clergy apart as a separate order of men. In America, anyone could minister. They didn't need to work through a church. They didn't need to work through an ecclesiastical body. Second, in terms of the democratization of American Christianity, ordinary people were empowered to take their deepest spiritual impulses at face value rather than subjecting them to the scrutiny of Orthodox doctrine, or whether it was somehow upheld by an ecclesial body. Further, those who did choose to minister did not have to be subject to oversight of any kind. The democratization of American Christianity is the story of how ordinary folk came to defend the right of common people to shape their own faith and submit to leaders of their own choosing. So not only were leaders turned loose, but so were the followers. So we can follow whoever we want to follow. Well, the third big thing about this that Hatch notes is that there was little, if any, sense of limitations. There was a dream that a new age of religious and social harmony would just flow from their efforts. And democratization took hold, and it worked. It worked in the United States. There were excesses, there were issues, but it worked. The free market mindset, which is kind of what I just described, a free market kind of mindset, helped to ensure the vitality of American faith. It's often been pointed out that while Christianity in Europe, often under state churches, declined, in America, where religion was turned loose, it flourished because it allowed for innovation. That really was the heart of the separation of church and state that became part of America's founding constitution. It wasn't to keep the church out of the state. It was to keep the state out of the church. It was a direct reaction to and rejection of the state churches of Europe. You want to start a church in America? Go start a church. You want to start a new denomination? Go start a new denomination. You want things to be different? Then go for it. You want to do things different? Go for it. This led historian Sidney Mead to call America the great lively experiment. It had never been done before in history and in worlds. What is different in our day is that it has ceased to be seen, this freedom and this separation of church and state, in missional terms. It's not about the free exercise of religion in order to reach the populace anymore, but now it's the free exercise of religion to influence the government in the name of religion and to make it an agent of the church. In essence, big irony, let's go back and do what the UK did. Let's put Christianity in charge in an official way.
Well, in many ways, the desire to, or the temptation to keep one's religion private, outside of the public sphere, which is what France is asking, it's felt in America as well. I mean, among Christians, for sure. It's just not externally imposed, but oftentimes internally motivated. So do you think it shares a motivation of wanting to keep the peace, or do you think it's something else?
Oh, it's something else. Absolutely. I think. Yeah. Ray Kroc, who was the man who turned McDonald's into a fast food franchise, was once quoted as saying, "I believe in God, family, and McDonald's." But then he said, "But when I get to the office, I reverse that order." Not many in our world would find fault with that approach, at least in America. And it's because we've been shaped by the cultural current of privatization. This is so important to understand. Privatization is a process by which a chasm is created between the public and the private spheres of our life. And we put spiritual things in the private sphere, for example, the private arena, and we keep it out of the public part of our life. So when it comes to things like business or politics or even marriage in the home, personal faith is bracketed off. The process of privatization, if left unchecked, makes the Christian faith a matter of personal preference, trivialized to the realm of taste or opinion. When Theodore Roszak, the historian, came to the United States, after traveling to America, he remarked that the Christian faith, this was his assessment, privately engaging but socially irrelevant.
Hmm.
The influence of privatization really is profound. Faith does not simply have a new home in our private lives; it's no longer accepted outside of the private sphere. More than showing poor form, talk of faith has just been banished from the wider public arena. I remember reading a book by Page Smith, who's another historian and an educator, many, 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 many years ago. And he kind of made the quip. He said, God is not a proper topic for conversation, but lesbian politics is. And that's what's happened in our world. But privatization goes even farther. Once placed solely in our private worlds, faith becomes little more than a reflection of ourselves. Spirituality has become anything an individual desires it to be, a private affair, or to be developed as you see fit. Now, it's precisely this context that has compelled so many people to check the box of "I'm nothing," the nuns, and the rise of the nuns that we've talked about. Religion is, if anything, a public sphere manifestation of faith, but we don't want faith in the public sphere. Further, if we subscribe to a defined set of beliefs or historical links to orthodoxy, then our private world suddenly becomes out and it's held accountable by those historic links to orthodoxy or those beliefs, which is exactly what we don't want. We don't want any accountability. So privatization is really at war with what the establishment of religion would require. And that's why the rise of the nuns has benefited so much from, that current coursing through our country. But now let me just go ahead and state what I'm sure some people are thinking. But I'm also seeing a lot of public stuff where people very much want it public. In many ways, here's what's happening. We have two currents right now coursing through American religious culture. One is Christian nationalism, to just kind of make it short and sweet. I mean, it's more varied than that, but let's just say use that as an example. Christian nationalism, which wants the Christian faith front, public, center, in control, and the other is the current of privatization that is really moving toward a French model of secularism, removing it from the public sphere, creating what Newhouse called a naked public square. Who's going to win? What's going to be the final shaping? And certainly privatization has got a big head start, but Christian nationalism is making a lot of noise. So it's interesting to watch play out.
Mm. Well, you would think then if we have that current towards secularization that we'd be wise to see, well, how is this even working in France? Like, what has been the French response? Has this actually been successful in promoting peace among French citizens? Has it silenced the threat of, religious extremists or the everyday division that might result from differing religious ideology? How's it going?
You think we would be better learners from the French. And I mean this with great love and affection for my friends there. But, we drank deeply from the well of the Enlightenment, and then came the horrors of the French Revolution. And I don't think we learned that lesson very well. How did that play out? What happened with the revolution? It was massive bloodshed. And, it was awful. It was awful. Well, let's look at what the policy of Lafitte is doing now in France. It's not going well. It has not helped. In fact, many would say it's exacerbated a lot of problems. Every country has the same challenge, certainly in Western democracies, which is to establish a community where diverse groups, whether that diversity is religious, whether it is racial, whether it is regional, and somehow live in peace, somehow coexist and function as a whole, as a society. The flashpoint of late, where this approach that France has taken is showing its severe limitations, has been with the Muslim community. I kind of intimated that this. Initially, secularism in the Enlightenment was very anti-Christian. Now the flashpoint is less Christianity and more Islam. A lot of people don't know, why is France having all these issues with this? Well, it's because of their policy towards secularism coupled with they have the largest Muslim community in all of Europe. There are over 5 million in France alone. It's a stunning number, and most of them live in the poorest areas. For example, last year, many will remember that when a 17-year-old delivery driver of North African descent was shot and killed by police during a traffic stop. And that set off riots all across the nation. Before it was over, more than 200 cities and towns had reported arson attacks on public buildings and vehicle fires and clashes with police and looting. This year, if you've been following it, there's been violence and unrest in the New Caledonia region over a proposed change to France's constitution that would give voting rights to an increasing number of non-Indigenous residents. The article in the Atlantic that you referenced earlier put it, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes because I thought it was excellent. It's a few years old. There's some things that have happened since then that make it a little dated. But one of the things that she said, so we'll update it with some other articles of what's happening like right now. She said, and I actually pulled this out because I thought it was so really well done. She said, a hard commitment to Lecite, the philosophy of secularism, may cause as many fissures as it heals. If the history of religion reveals anything, it is that attempts at suppression tend to strengthen the determination of believers. And again, I think that's particularly true in France with their approaches to secularism. The Muslim population is making that case. That's the flashpoint. It's often seen as discriminatory. The whole Lecite approach of secularism, Muslims cry, that's so discriminatory. So Christians do too, but Muslims are the ones right now under the pressure of it the most because of the difference between Islam and Christianity. And particularly, I would say Islam and Judaism and the Christian faith. France tends to treat Christian customs as just part of everyday culture, but it treats the visible signs of other faiths, other religions, such as the hijab worn by Muslim women, as unacceptable. And here's why. Christian traditions focus mostly on belief, which are private. Islamic and Jewish traditions emphasize practices, which are very public, and including dress, hair, beards, symbols, which is why the survey was taken last year in France, found that almost 80% of French Muslims, it's a staggeringly high number, 80% of French Muslims believe their country's secularism laws are discriminatory. And let me just give you one example of why they would say that. For example, the ban on headscarves in all public schools, just a flat out ban. So that means here you have a young Muslim girl who's forced to choose between whether I'll be true to my religion or whether I'll get an education. She can't do both. And so if she's going to stay true to her faith and keep on her headscarf, she doesn't go to school and she doesn't get an education. And the poverty that is so prevalent among the Muslims in France, as I said, most of them live in the poorest areas, is just ongoing. So you can just feel that tension and just can sense that the conflict is just going to grow and grow and grow. And so the peace that they think that they're keeping, the public peace, actually what it's doing is creating a lot of public conflict. So I would say that it's not working very well at all, that freedom from religion has led to simply no freedom at all for many who have it.
This has been such a rich conversation. I just thinking about how, gosh, in a very old episode that we did, when you were outlining how to be a student of culture, you talked about the importance of being a student of history. And I feel like this discussion is such a great example of that, of what we need to take from history so that we can walk forward with more wisdom. But whether we're going to do that or not will be another matter. But yeah, thank you, Jim. This has been really helpful. And as always, we pray that this was helpful for you guys listening and that you'll join us again next week. So hope to see you there.